There was a time when your reactions felt immediate. Something would happen in front of you and your mind would form a response without hesitation. A situation felt right or wrong, and the feeling arrived clearly without needing to be examined first. Your instincts moved quickly then. You noticed things in conversations, a tone that didn't match the words being spoken, a pause that suggested something wasn't fully said. You felt small shifts in the atmosphere of a room, and your mind accepted those signals naturally. You trusted that sense. If something felt uncomfortable, you allowed yourself to recognize the discomfort. If someone's words didn't quite match their expression, you noticed it and moved forward with that awareness. You didn't feel the need to pause and investigate whether your perception was correct before allowing it to exist. Your judgment felt like part of you. But slowly, something began to change. The signals that once felt clear started to meet a quiet question before they could fully settle. A reaction would appear inside you, and almost immediately another thought would step in beside it. Are you sure about that? The question didn't arrive as criticism. It sounded more like caution. A small hesitation that suggested your first interpretation might not be completely accurate. At first, you welcomed that hesitation. It seemed thoughtful to examine your reactions instead of accepting them immediately. It felt responsible to consider whether there might be another explanation for what you were noticing, so you gave the second thought a little more space. Instead of trusting the first signal that appeared, you began checking it. You replayed what had just happened in your mind, searching for details you might have misunderstood. The feeling that arrived naturally was held for a moment while you looked at it more carefully, and sometimes, while you were examining it, the instinct itself became quieter, not gone, just softer. Over time, this pause began appearing more often. A situation would unfold in front of you, and the first response would still appear inside your mind, but instead of moving forward with it, you would stop for a moment and look at it from a distance. You would ask yourself whether that reaction was fair, whether you might be interpreting the situation too strongly, whether there was something about the moment you had missed. Gradually, the instinct that once spoke clearly began arriving with less confidence. It was still there, but it had learned that before it could be trusted, it would need to answer a question first. At first, the change is almost impossible to notice. Your instinct still appears, just as it always did. A situation unfolds, someone says something, a tone shifts slightly, and your mind forms an immediate understanding of what you are seeing. But now that understanding does not stand alone for long. Almost as quickly as the reaction forms, another thought arrives beside it. It doesn't shout or argue. It simply asks a quiet question that lingers just long enough to slow the moment down. Are you sure that's what's happening? The instinct you felt a second ago is still there, but now it has company. The new thought begins looking at the same moment from a different angle, suggesting there may be another explanation. Perhaps the tone you noticed meant something else. Perhaps the expression you saw wasn't what it seemed. At first, this feels like careful thinking. You might even feel proud of the way you examine situations more closely than before. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You review the moment with more patience, giving yourself time to understand it fully. But something subtle happens during that pause. The instinct that appeared first begins to lose its place. While you are searching for alternative explanations, the original signal becomes quieter. The feeling that once arrived clearly now sits in the background while the analysis grows louder. You begin collecting possibilities instead of conclusions. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe I misunderstood the tone. Maybe I reacted too quickly. None of these thoughts feel unreasonable. In fact, they sound thoughtful and fair. You are simply making sure you do not misjudge the situation. But slowly, the balance begins to shift. The instinct that once guided your understanding becomes something you hold at a distance. Instead of trusting it immediately, you treat it as a possibility that needs to be examined. Every reaction must now pass through a quiet review before it is allowed to stand. Over time, this review becomes automatic. A moment happens, your instinct responds, and almost immediately the questioning begins. You turn the situation over in your mind, searching for details that might prove the instinct wrong. You imagine other explanations, other interpretations, other ways the moment could be understood. And because there are always other possibilities, the instinct rarely receives a clear answer. So it waits. It grows quieter, not because it disappeared, but because it learned that its voice will be questioned before it can be believed. After a while, the questioning no longer feels like a pause. It becomes the place where your thinking now begins. A situation happens and your instinct still appears, but it no longer carries the same authority it once had. The reaction forms inside you, clear for a brief moment, and then almost immediately the second voice steps forward to examine it. You notice something in the way a person speaks, the way their tone shifts, or the way a conversation changes direction. Your instinct reacts to that signal the way it always has. But now, instead of letting the reaction guide your understanding, you stop and hold it in place. You begin looking at it carefully, almost as if it belongs to someone else. Are you reading this correctly? The question is not harsh, but it is persistent. It stays just long enough to slow your confidence. What once felt like a clear signal now feels like something that must be inspected before it can be trusted. So you begin studying the moment more closely. You replay what just happened. You examine the words that were spoken and the way they were delivered. You look again at the expressions you noticed, searching for details that might change the meaning of what you first understood. And slowly, the instinct begins to lose its certainty. The original reaction becomes one possibility among many. It no longer stands on its own. Instead, it sits beside a growing list of other explanations that feel equally possible. Maybe they meant something else. Maybe I interpreted that too strongly. Maybe I'm seeing something that isn't really there. Each of these thoughts sounds reasonable. None of them feel dramatic or exaggerated. They simply suggest that the moment might have another meaning that your first reaction did not notice. But the longer you stay in that process, the harder it becomes to return to the instinct that started it. The feeling that once guided your understanding now appears uncertain even to you. You begin watching it from a distance, treating it like something that must prove itself before it can be believed. Over time, the pattern repeats often enough that the instinct itself begins to change. It arrives more quietly than before, not because it disappeared, but because it expects the questioning that will follow. It knows that before it can guide you, it will need to defend itself against the doubts that now arrive almost automatically. And while that quiet examination continues, the instinct slowly fades into the background of your thinking. Not gone, just waiting to see if it will be allowed to speak at all. After some time, the questioning becomes so familiar that it begins to feel like part of the way your mind works. The instinct still appears, but it no longer arrives alone. Almost immediately, another thought steps in beside it, followed by another possibility, and then another small explanation that asks you to reconsider what you first understood. None of these thoughts are loud. They do not argue with your instinct directly. They simply gather around it, one after another, offering different ways the moment might be interpreted. At first, this feels careful and thoughtful. You are not rushing to conclusions. You are allowing space for different meanings to exist before deciding what something truly meant. But gradually, the number of possibilities begins to outweigh the instinct that appeared first. A reaction forms inside you, and instead of moving forward with it, you begin examining it from several directions at once. You imagine how the moment might look from someone else's perspective. You consider explanations that place the situation in a different light. You revisit details that seemed insignificant before. Each new thought feels reasonable on its own. Yet together, they create a kind of quiet distance between you and the original signal that appeared in your mind. The instinct that once guided your understanding now waits in the background while the analysis grows more detailed. Instead of asking whether your first reaction might be right, you begin searching for reasons it might be wrong. Over time, the instinct learns something from this pattern. It learns that its voice will be questioned before it can be trusted. And so it begins to speak more softly. Not because it has disappeared, but because it expects the hesitation that will follow. The instinct still notices the same signals it always did. It still reacts to the tone of a voice, the shift in a conversation, the subtle changes in the atmosphere of a room. But now it pauses, almost as if it is waiting for permission. Meanwhile, the explanations continue to gather quietly around it. Each one adds another layer of interpretation, another possibility that asks you to reconsider what you felt in the first place. Eventually, the room inside your mind becomes filled with these small uncertainties. Nothing in that space is loud or chaotic. Everything remains calm and thoughtful. But the original signal that once guided you clearly now stands among many other voices. And in that quiet crowd of possibilities, it becomes harder to hear the instinct that used to speak so simply.